I watched my mother slip the pearl necklace, my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one she'd promised me on her deathbed, around my sister Eliza's throat, and I smiled. Not the tight, bitter smile I'd worn in my first life when this exact scene had played out. No, this was genuine, because this time I knew exactly what was coming. "It looks perfect on you, darling," Mother cooed, adjusting the clasp. "Your grandmother would have wanted you to have it." I stood in the doorway of Eliza's bedroom, watching them in the mirror. Neither had noticed me yet. In my previous life, I'd burst into tears at this moment. I'd screamed about promises and fairness until Father came running and slapped me for being hysterical. The necklace stayed with Eliza. Everything always stayed with Eliza. "Actually," I said softly, and they both jumped. "I think Grandmother would have wanted exactly this." Mother's face hardened. "Cassandra, we've discussed this. The necklace suits Eliza's complexion better." "Of course it does," I agreed, stepping into the room. "She should definitely wear it to the Bennett Gala next week." They exchanged confused glances. Eliza's fingers went to the pearls protectively. "You're not going to throw another tantrum?" "Why would I? You two deserve each other." I turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Eliza, make sure you get lots of pictures. You'll want to remember that night." I left them whispering behind me, no doubt trying to figure out my angle. Let them wonder. In my first life, I'd spent 28 years being the family disappointment before I'd finally escaped their toxicity, only to die in a car accident on my way to sign the papers that would have made me partner at my law firm. I'd spent my last conscious moments not thinking about my success, but about how my family hadn't even bothered to attend my law school graduation. Then I'd woken up at 17, the morning after Grandmother's funeral, with 28 years of memories burning in my mind like brands. The first time through this life, I'd been so desperate to make them love me. I'd bent myself into shapes that weren't me, trying to be the daughter they wanted, but Eliza was their golden child, born with the right face, the right temperament, the right everything. I was just the spare, kept around to make Eliza look better by comparison. This time, I had no intention of competing for scraps of affection. This time, I was going to give them exactly what they wanted and make sure they choked on it. The abuse had been subtle at first. I remembered being 5 years old, showing my parents the painting I'd made in kindergarten. Mother had glanced at it, then turned to admire Eliza's macaroni necklace for 20 minutes. When I'd started crying, Father told me I was too sensitive and needed to learn not to be so needy. It escalated from there. By the time I was 8, I'd learned that my achievements made my parents uncomfortable. When I won the school spelling bee, Father said it was unfair that I'd made Eliza feel bad by showing off. When I made the honor roll, Mother reminded me that grades weren't everything, while simultaneously bragging about Eliza's B+ average to everyone she met. At 12, I'd discovered my grandmother was funding private tutors for Eliza, but had been told I didn't need them because I was naturally smarter. The truth was that Grandmother had only been funding Eliza's tutors because my parents had told her I was doing fine. They'd been pocketing the money meant for my education and using it to buy Eliza designer clothes and riding lessons. At 15, they'd forgotten my birthday entirely. They were too busy planning Eliza's Sweet 16, which was still 6 months away. At 17, Grandmother died. The funeral was on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, my parents were dividing up her jewelry, and I wasn't invited to the discussion. When I'd found out they'd given Eliza everything, including the necklace Grandmother had explicitly promised me, I'd finally broken down. That was when Father had hit me for the first time. Not a quick slap, but a closed-fist punch that left me with a black eye I'd had to hide with makeup for weeks. He told me I was selfish for trying to take things from my sister. Mother stood behind him, nodding. In my first life, that had been my breaking point. I'd withdrawn completely, becoming a ghost in my own home. I'd focused on school like it was a life raft, because it was. I'd graduated valedictorian, though my parents skipped the ceremony to attend Eliza's piano recital. I'd gotten a full scholarship to Yale. They'd asked why I couldn't have gone somewhere closer to home like Eliza, who was attending community college. I'd been accepted to Harvard Law. They'd complained about how I never called. The years blurred together after that. I'd built a successful career while they'd built Eliza's life. funding her failed business ventures and paying for her lavish wedding to a man who'd cheated on her within 6 months. When Eliza's husband left her, they'd given her my old college fund, the one they'd promised still existed, to help her get back on her feet. It was empty. They'd spent it all on her years ago. I'd stopped visiting, stopped calling, built a life they weren't part of. And then I died right on the cusp of everything I'd worked for, with their disappointment still echoing in my skull. But now I was back, and I knew every betrayal that was coming. More importantly, I knew how to use them. The rebirth itself had been jarring. I'd woken up in my childhood bedroom 17 again, with my head full of futures that no longer existed. It had taken me 3 days to accept it was real. 3 days of testing the limits, saying things I'd never said before, watching how people reacted. The key revelation came when I realized that while my future had changed, the past was identical. Everything that had happened before, grandmother's death was exactly as I remembered, which meant everyone's patterns, their choices, their fundamental natures, those were fixed. They would keep making the same decisions unless I gave them reasons to make different ones. So I'd started planning, not to win their love. I understood now that was never possible. They'd decided who I was when I was too young to protest, and nothing I could do would change their narrative. But I could change the ending. I could make sure their choice to favor Eliza destroyed them instead of me. The first step was easy. Let them keep choosing her. Let them give her everything. Let them pour all their resources, all their support, all their attention into their golden child. And then make sure every single thing they gave her turned to ashes. The Bennett Gala was in 5 days. In my first life, it had been one of the most important social events of my teenage years, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Roger Bennett was old money, and his annual charity gala was where the city's elite came to see and be seen. In my original timeline, Eliza had worn grandmother's pearls and caught the eye of Marcus Whitfield, heir to the Whitfield pharmaceutical fortune. They'd dated for 3 years before getting engaged. It should have been a fairy tale. It would have been if Marcus hadn't been a monster. I'd only learned the truth years later, after Eliza's first marriage had imploded. She'd gotten drunk at a family dinner and let slip that Marcus had been controlling and abusive, that he'd isolated her from her friends and monitored her every move. She'd broken off the engagement 2 weeks before the wedding, and our parents had been furious, not at Marcus, but at her for throwing away her future. That revelation had been one of the few moments I'd felt sympathy for my sister. Not enough to forgive her for all the years of her complicity in my mistreatment, but enough to be glad she'd escaped. This time, she wouldn't escape. This time, I was going to make sure she walked right into Marcus Whitfield's arms, and I was going to make sure our parents pushed her every step of the way. The morning of the gala, I woke up early and went for a run. When I came back, the house was in chaos. Eliza was crying in her room, Mother was shouting into her phone, and Father was pacing in his study. I found them all in Eliza's room 20 minutes later. What happened? I asked, though I knew. I'd made it happen. Someone stole Eliza's dress, Mother hissed. The Valentino we had custom made, it's gone. That's terrible, I said, keeping my face neutral. When's she supposed to leave for the gala? 6 hours, Eliza sobbed. There's no time to get anything else tailored. I let the silence stretch out just long enough, then said, she could wear mine. They all turned to stare at me. You have a gala dress? Father said skeptically. I bought one last week. It's a Marchesa, off the rack, but it's already altered to fit me. We're close enough in size that it would probably work. I paused. If she wants it? Mother's eyes narrowed. Why would you give your dress to your sister? Because I'm not going to the gala. I'd already declined the invitation yesterday, claiming I had too much AP exam prep to do. And because she needs it more than I do. It was almost too easy. Within an hour, Eliza was trying on my midnight blue Marchesa, and Mother was crying about what a beautiful, selfless daughter I was. Father actually hugged me. Eliza even thanked me, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. They had no idea I'd been the one who'd paid a courier to accidentally deliver her Valentino to the wrong address, one I'd already confirmed would be out of the country for 2 weeks. By the time they tracked it down, it would be too late. And they had no idea that the Marchesa, stunning as it was, would photograph terribly next to the Bennett family's burgundy decor. Eliza would look washed out in every photo, forgettable at best. But the pearls, grandmother's pearls, would shine. Marcus Whitfield wouldn't notice my sister in that dress, but he would notice those pearls. His mother had a matching set inherited from the same jewelry line. He'd approach her to ask about them, and Eliza, desperate for attention after feeling invisible all night, would charm him with the story of our dead grandmother and her precious heirloom. Everything was going exactly according to plan. The day after the gala, Eliza came home starry-eyed and wouldn't stop talking about Marcus. Mother was ecstatic. Father started researching the Whitfield family's net worth. I acted thrilled for her. I asked questions about Marcus, encouraged her to text him, even helped her pick outfits for their first date. My parents were so shocked by my supportive behavior that they actually started being nicer to me. For 2 whole weeks, I got to experience what it must have been like to be Eliza, the favorite child. It almost made me feel guilty. Almost. Because I knew what Marcus was. I knew that his charm was a mask for his controlling nature. I knew that he kept a list of his girlfriend's passwords and tracked their locations. I knew that he'd once pushed an ex down a flight of stairs and his family's lawyers had made it disappear. In my first life, Eliza had figured it out in time to escape, but that was because I'd loaned her money for an apartment after one of her business failures, giving her somewhere to go when she'd finally decided to leave him. This time, I wasn't going to give her that out. This time, she'd be completely dependent on him and on our parents, who would pressure her to stay with him no matter what. It took 3 months for Marcus to propose. Eliza said yes, of course. Our parents threw an engagement party that cost more than my entire college education would have. I smiled through it all, playing the supportive sister while I laid the groundwork for phase 2 of my plan. Phase 2 required money, more money than a 17-year-old should have, but I had something better than money. I had knowledge of the future. The stock market in 2008, I was back in 2006 now, was about to go through dramatic changes. I knew which tech startups would explode and which would collapse. I knew which real estate markets would crash and which would soar. I knew which cryptocurrencies would emerge and when. The problem was that I was a minor with no capital and no credibility. The solution was grandmother's real will. In my first life, I'd never known grandmother had left me anything. My parents had told me she'd left everything to them, to divide as they saw fit. I'd believed them, but in my early 20s, I'd run into grandmother's lawyer at a conference. Mr. Chen had been shocked to learn I'd never received my inheritance. He'd told me that grandmother had left me a substantial trust fund set to be released when I turned 21, along with a collection of rare books and her shares in the family company. My parents had forged my signature and stolen all of it. By the time I'd found out, the statute of limitations had passed. I couldn't sue. Mr. Chen had been apologetic but helpless. The money was gone, spent on Eliza's lifestyle and my parents' retirement fund. This time, I wasn't waiting until 21. I went to Mr. Chen's office on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Eliza's engagement. I'd called ahead saying I had questions about grandmother's estate. He'd sounded surprised but agreed to meet me. "Miss Cassandra," he said, ushering me into his office. "I'm glad you called. I've been meaning to reach out about your grandmother's will." "I know what she left me," I said quietly. "And I know my parents haven't told me about it." His face went carefully neutral. "What makes you say that?" "Because they've never told me about anything that was mine. And because grandmother told me before she died that she'd made sure I was taken care of." This was a lie, but a plausible one. "She said you'd explain everything when the time was right." Mr. Chen studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "You're 17. The trust isn't supposed to be discussed with you until you're 21. "But I can know about it now, can't I, legally?" "Yes," he admitted. "Your grandmother didn't want to burden you too early, but she didn't forbid it either." "Then tell me, please. I need to know what's mine." He pulled out a file, thick with documents. "Your grandmother left you $500,000 in a trust fund, accessible at 21. She also left you her complete collection of first edition books, valued at approximately $200,000, and her 30% share in Chen Holdings, the family company." I let myself look shocked, even though I knew all this. That's millions. "The shares alone are worth about $3 million currently, yes. Your grandmother was very specific in her will. These assets are yours and yours alone. Your parents are trustees until you're 21, but they're not allowed to touch the principal or make any decisions about the assets without your written consent. Have they asked for my consent? His pause told me everything. No. Have they accessed the accounts? Miss Cassandra, have they? I can't discuss the details of account activity with you until you're 21. But you can confirm whether my signature appears on any documents related to my inheritance, can't you? He looked uncomfortable. Yes. And does it? Another pause. Yes, multiple times. And do you have copies of those signatures on file? Of course. May I see them? He hesitated, then pulled out several documents. I looked at the signatures, my name, but not my handwriting. Not even close. That's not my signature, I said clearly. None of these are. My parents forged them. Mr. Chen went pale. Miss Cassandra, that's a serious accusation. It's also true. I've never signed any of these documents. I've never even seen them before today. I met his eyes. And I think you know that. I think you've suspected it for a while. He was quiet for a long moment. If what you're saying is true, this is fraud. We'd need to involve the police. Your parents could go to prison. I know, I said softly, but I'm not interested in sending them to prison. Not yet, anyway. Right now, I just want what's mine. Can you help me? You're still a minor. Even with the will, your parents are your legal guardians. They have authority over us, over me, yes, but not over my grandmother's wishes. She left these things to me specifically. If they've been stealing from my inheritance, that's not parental authority. That's theft. Mr. Chen leaned back in his chair, thinking. What do you want to do? I want to file for emancipation, I said. And I want to use my trust fund as proof that I can support myself. Can the trust be accessed early if I'm legally emancipated? Possibly, with court approval and a good reason. Starting college early is a good reason, isn't it? He raised an eyebrow. You're planning to start college early? I'm graduating high school this year, a year early. I've already been taking AP classes and summer courses. I'll have enough credits by June. This was true. In my first life, I'd done it to escape my family faster. I've been accepted to several universities for early admission. I just need the funds to pay for it. This was a lie. I hadn't applied anywhere yet. But I would. And with my academic record, I'd get in. That might work, Mr. Chen said slowly. But emancipation is a long process. And your parents would fight it. Let them fight. They'll lose. I stood up. Thank you, Mr. Chen. I'll be in touch soon with a formal request for emancipation proceedings. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if you didn't mention this conversation to my parents. Legally, I don't have to tell them anything until you file official papers. Good. I left his office with my mind racing. Emancipation would take months, maybe longer. I needed a faster solution to access funds now for the investments I needed to make before the market shifted. The answer came to me on the drive home. I didn't need to access my trust fund. I just needed to stop my parents from accessing it first. The next day, I called Mr. Chen back and told him I wanted to file a formal complaint about the forged signatures. Not criminal charges, not yet, but enough to freeze the accounts and trigger an investigation. It would tie everything up in legal red tape for months, preventing my parents from taking another penny while I built my own resources. He agreed to file the paperwork. Within a week, the accounts were frozen pending investigation. My parents didn't tell me about it. They didn't tell me that their access to my inheritance had been cut off, or that Mr. Chen was asking questions about signature authenticity. They just started looking stressed and having quiet, tense conversations behind closed doors. I knew they'd been planning to drain more from my accounts to pay for Eliza's wedding. Now they couldn't. They'd have to use their own money they'd been planning to use for early retirement. I couldn't access the funds either, not yet. but I didn't need grandmother's money for what came next. I just needed to make sure my parents couldn't use it to cushion the fall I was building for them. For my own investment capital, I had another plan. I'd been tutoring since I was 15. Math, science, English, anything people would pay for. In my first life, I'd saved every penny for college. This time, I'd been saving for something else. By the time I froze my trust fund, I had $8,000 in cash hidden in my room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. The problem was that no legitimate broker would let a 17-year-old open an investment account without parental consent. But I didn't need a legitimate broker. I needed someone willing to bend the rules for the right price. I found him through a classmate whose older brother worked in finance. Dylan was 23, cocky, and not quite ethical enough to make it at a real firm. He was perfect. "Let me get this straight," Dylan said when we met at a coffee shop. "You want me to open an investment account in my name, let you make all the trading decisions, and give you 80% of the profits?" "Correct. You get 20% for doing basically nothing except signing some papers." "Why would a high school kid know anything about investing?" "Do you care as long as the money's real?" He grinned. "No, but if you lose it all, I won't." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've already lived through the next decade and know exactly what's going to happen," I thought. Out loud, I said, "I've been studying the market for years. I have a system, and I'm willing to prove it to you. Take $1,000 of my money and let me make trades for 1 month. If I don't at least double it, keep everything, and we part ways. If I do double it, we go all in with the rest of my capital, and you get your 20%. He considered this, then shrugged. "Sure, why not? Worst case, I make $1,000. When do we start?" "Today." I gave him the first $1,000 and a list of trades to make. Small tech companies that I knew were about to announce major contracts, pharmaceutical stocks that would spike when certain drug trials succeeded, real estate funds that were about to acquire valuable properties. In 3 weeks, the $1,000 became $1,800. Dylan's eyes went wide when he saw the returns. Do we have a deal for the full amount?" "Hell yes." I gave him the remaining $7,000 and started playing the market in earnest. By the time Eliza's wedding rolled around 6 months later, my original $8,000 had become $140,000. Dylan was making more money than he'd ever made in his life, and he stopped asking questions about how I knew what I knew. I reinvested everything, building my capital base while I waited for the big opportunities I knew were coming. The iPhone would launch in a year. I made sure we had Apple stock. Facebook was about to open to the public. I had Dylan set up for the IPO. Bitcoin would emerge in a few years. I was already planning how to get in early, but all of that was long-term. For my immediate revenge, I needed to focus on the wedding. Eliza's wedding to Marcus Whitfield was scheduled for June, a year after they'd met. My parents had spent the intervening months fawning over the Whitfields and planning an event that would bankrupt them. In my first life, the wedding had cost $300,000. My parents had taken out a second mortgage to pay for it. Then Eliza had called it off 2 weeks before the ceremony, leaving them in debt with no way to recoup costs. This time, I was going to make sure the wedding happened, and I was going to make sure it destroyed everyone involved. The first step was ensuring Eliza didn't get cold feet. In my original timeline, she'd started seeing Marcus's controlling nature about 6 months into the relationship. He'd begun tracking her phone, questioning her friendships, making subtle comments about her appearance. She'd tried to talk to our parents about it, but they'd dismissed her concerns as wedding jitters. Then she'd found his list, the spreadsheet where he tracked every detail of his girlfriends' lives, and she'd run. This time, I made sure she never found that list. I did it by becoming Marcus's confidant. It started innocently enough. He'd come to the house to see Eliza, and I'd make conversation while she was getting ready. I was the smart sister, the one who wasn't trying to compete for his attention. He could relax around me, talk about real things. I encouraged this, asked him about his business, his family, his interests, laughed at his jokes, made him feel understood, and slowly, carefully, I learned where he kept his secrets. He password protected his computer, but he'd told me once that he used his mother's maiden name plus his birth year. He thought his office at home was secure, but he'd mentioned that the spare key was hidden in a fake rock by his back door. I filed all of this information away and waited. 3 months before the wedding, on a night when I knew Marcus was away on business, and Eliza was with our mother finalizing catering details, I used the spare key I'd had made from the rock and let myself into his house. I found the list within 20 minutes. It was everything I remembered: names, addresses, phone passwords, schedules, intimate details. Years of surveillance on women who'd trusted him. I didn't delete it. Instead, I moved it to a hidden folder, buried deep in his file system where Eliza would never stumble across it. Then I changed the password on the folder to something only I would know: insurance, for later. With the list hidden, Eliza had no reason to doubt Marcus. His controlling behavior continued, but without hard evidence, she convinced herself she was being paranoid. Our parents reinforced this every time she expressed concern. "You're just nervous about the wedding," Mother would say. "Marcus comes from such a good family," Father would add. "You're lucky to have him." And I'd nod along, playing the supportive sister. "Every couple has adjustments to make. I'm sure it'll get better after the wedding, once you're both less stressed." Eliza wanted to believe me, so she did. The wedding happened on schedule. It was obscenely lavish. My parents had spared no expense to impress the Whitfields. The ceremony was at the city's most expensive venue. The dress was haute couture. The flowers alone cost more than a car. I was a bridesmaid wearing a dress Eliza had chosen that made me look deliberately frumpy. I didn't care. I smiled in all the photos, danced at the reception, and gave a toast about how happy I was for my sister. And I watched as Eliza legally bound herself to a man who would make her life hell. The best part? My parents had indeed taken out a second mortgage to pay for everything. But this time, they couldn't access my trust fund to help with the debt. They were completely exposed. Phase 3 of my plan was about to begin. I turned 18 3 months after Eliza's wedding. The day I became a legal adult, I filed for full control of my inheritance. Mr. Chen had the paperwork ready. With the forged signatures already documented and my parents unable to explain them, the court had no choice but to grant me full access to my assets. The trust fund, the books, the shares in Chen Holdings, all of it became mine. My parents tried to fight it. They hired a lawyer and claimed I was being manipulated, that I was too young to handle such wealth, that they'd only been trying to protect me. The judge didn't buy it, especially not when Mr. Chen presented evidence that they'd already spent over $200,000 of my money on expenses they couldn't account for. The ruling came down on a Friday afternoon. All my assets were to be transferred to my sole control, and my parents were ordered to repay the $200,000 they'd stolen. If they couldn't repay it within 6 months, the court would place liens on their property. I saw Father's face when the verdict was read. He aged 10 years and 10 seconds. Mother was worse. She stood up and screamed at the judge that I was a selfish, ungrateful child who was destroying my family. Security had to escort her out. I didn't say a word, I just signed the papers and left. That night, I moved out. I'd already arranged an apartment near the university I'd be attending in the fall. I packed one suitcase of clothes and my laptop and walked out of my childhood home for the last time. My parents called 63 times over the next week. I didn't answer. Eliza sent increasingly desperate texts asking me to reconsider, to think about the family. I blocked her number. I was done being their victim. Now I was going to be their reckoning. My inheritance gave me options. The $500,000 from the trust fund became seed capital for larger investments. The rare books I sold to collectors for actual market value, not the lowball $200,000 estimate. They brought in $340,000. The shares in Chen Holdings I kept, but I started attending shareholder meetings and asking pointed questions about company direction. My parents' plan had been to vote my shares on my behalf forever, maintaining their control over the family company. Now I was voting for myself, and I had enough shares to block any major decisions. The first thing I blocked was Father's proposed salary increase. The second was a consulting contract for one of his friends, a contract that would have funneled company money into Father's pocket through kickbacks. He tried to meet with me to discuss it. I declined. He showed up at my apartment. I called security. "Cassandra, please," he'd begged through my door. "We're family. We can work through this." "We stopped being family when you forged my signature and stole from me," I'd called back. "Now we're just shareholders in the same company, and I vote no." He'd left, but I knew it wasn't over. I'd humiliated him in front of the other board members. He'd want revenge. I was counting on it. Meanwhile, my investment portfolio was exploding. Dylan was making trades based on my instructions, and we were consistently beating the market by impossible margins. The $140,000 I'd had at Eliza's wedding had become $890,000 by my 18th birthday. 6 months later, it was $2.1 million. Dylan stopped questioning how I knew what I knew and started treating me like a genius. He wanted to quit his day job and manage my money full-time. I agreed with one condition. Everything stayed in his name until I turned 21. I didn't want my parents knowing how much money I was making. He thought I was being paranoid. I knew I was being strategic because I hadn't forgotten about Marcus. Eliza's marriage was falling apart right on schedule. Marcus had become openly controlling after the wedding, now that she was legally bound to him. He monitored her phone, chose her friends, dictated her schedule. She'd stopped working at his insistence. He wanted a wife who focused on home and family. She'd tried to talk to our parents about it. They'd told her she was being dramatic. Marriage required compromise, they said. Marcus was a good provider. She should be grateful. I knew this because Eliza still tried to contact me sometimes. She'd send emails I didn't respond to, leave voicemails I didn't listen to. But I'd check her social media occasionally, and I could see the life draining from her eyes in every photo. Good. A year into the marriage, she reached out again. This time, she was more direct. Cassandra, I know you're angry with me, and you have every right to be, but I need help. Marcus is... I think he's dangerous. I want to leave him, but I don't have any money. Mom and Dad say I'm overreacting, but I'm scared. Please, I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm asking anyway. You're the only one who's ever really understood what it's like when they don't have your back. I stared at that email for a long time. In my first life, I'd helped her. I'd loaned her money, found her an apartment, stood up to our parents when they tried to force her back to Marcus. It had been the beginning of something like a real relationship between us. Not quite sisterhood, but at least mutual respect. She'd paid me back eventually, attended my law school graduation when our parents hadn't, sent flowers when I made partner. Small gestures, but they'd meant something. This time, I deleted the email. 3 days later, she tried calling. I didn't answer. A week after that, she showed up at my apartment. I didn't let her in. Please, she sobbed through the door. I don't know where else to go. You have parents, I said coldly, a husband, a whole family who chose you over me every single day of our lives. Go back to them. Cassandra, I gave you my dress, Eliza. I gave you my support. I smiled at your wedding and pretended to be happy for you. I've given you everything I'm ever going to give you. We're done. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry for all of it. I know I was awful to you. I know Mom and Dad were awful to you, but please, go home, Eliza. She eventually left. I watched from my window as she got into her car and drove away, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I felt nothing. Actually, that's not true. I felt satisfied. The financial crisis hit in 2008, right on schedule. I'd positioned my portfolio perfectly, short on subprime mortgages, heavy on companies that would weather the storm, ready to buy the dip when everything crashed. When the market tanked, my wealth exploded. 2.1 million became 5 million in a matter of months. Dylan was beside himself with excitement. He called me a prophet, if he only knew. But the crash did more than make me rich. It destroyed my parents. The second mortgage they'd taken out for Eliza's wedding, the interest rate had been variable, tied to the housing market. When the market crashed, their monthly payments tripled. Suddenly, they couldn't afford the house they'd lived in for 30 years. They tried to refinance. No bank would touch them. They tried to sell. No buyers in a crashed market. Father had to take out personal loans just to make the payments. Mother went back to work for the first time in 25 years. And then Father lost his job. The company he'd worked at for decades was downsizing, and he was expensive. They let him go with a minimal severance package. Desperate, he turned to Chen Holdings. He asked the board for a consulting position, essentially a charity job to keep him afloat. I voted no. The other board members, who'd been watching me block Father's schemes for 2 years and respected my business acumen, sided with me. Father was furious. He called me from the parking lot of the Chen Holdings building, screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. You're destroying this family, bye, he roared. Your mother and I are about to lose our home. Eliza's marriage is a nightmare, and you're just sitting on your pile of money watching us suffer. Yes, I said calmly. I am. How can you be so cruel? We're your parents. You're the people who raised me, yes. But you stopped being my parents a long time ago, around the time you decided I wasn't worth loving. We always loved you. No, you loved Eliza. You tolerated me. There's a difference. I paused. You know what the funny thing is? I'm not even doing anything to you. I'm just not saving you. I'm letting you deal with the consequences of your own choices. The mortgage you took out. The money you stole from me. The golden child you invested everything in while treating me like garbage. None of this is my fault. It's yours. Please, he said, and his voice broke. Cassandra, please. I'm begging you, we'll lose everything. I lost everything every day of my childhood, I said. I lost my family's love, my grandmother's inheritance, my sense of self-worth. I lost years of my life trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it to me. So, forgive me if I don't feel sorry for you losing a house. I hung up. They declared bankruptcy 6 months later. The house was foreclosed on. They moved into a small apartment in a bad part of town. Mother's job barely covered rent. Father couldn't find work. He was overqualified for entry-level positions and underqualified for anything requiring current skills. I heard about all of this through the social grapevine, not from them directly. They'd stopped trying to contact me. I think they'd finally realized I meant what I said. Eliza was still with Marcus, still trapped, still miserable, and I still had insurance waiting. I graduated from university at 20, a year early, summa cum laude, triple major in business, finance, and computer science. I'd chosen a state school instead of an Ivy League. I didn't need prestige anymore, just efficiency. No one from my family attended graduation. I hadn't invited them. My investment portfolio had grown to $12 million by then. Dylan had become a legitimate fund manager on the back of my success, running a small firm with me as his sole client. He still didn't know I was the brains behind everything, and I preferred it that way. Better to be underestimated. I used part of the money to start my own company, a tech startup focused on cybersecurity. I knew which vulnerabilities would be exploited in the coming years, which security protocols would become standard. My company was ahead of the curve on everything. By 22, I'd sold the company for $45 million. By 23, I was worth over $100 million. I lived in a penthouse downtown. I drove a car that cost more than my parents' foreclosed house. I wore clothes that would have paid for Eliza's entire wedding. And I was still the family ghost. They never called, never wrote. I'd vanished from their lives as completely as they'd once made me feel invisible. It was almost perfect. Almost. Because I still had one more move to make. Marcus Whitfield's controlling behavior had escalated over the years. By the time Eliza had been married to him for 5 years, she was essentially a prisoner in her own life. He controlled her money, her movements, her relationships. She had no bank account he didn't monitor, no friends he hadn't approved, no freedom he hadn't granted. She tried to leave him twice that I knew of. Both times, he'd convinced her to stay, once with tears and promises, once with threats. Our parents still thought she was lucky to have him. I decided it was time to destroy that illusion. I still had access to Marcus's files. He'd never changed his computer password. Arrogance and habit made him sloppy. I'd been monitoring his digital life for years, watching his surveillance of Eliza grow more obsessive. I'd also been collecting evidence. Screen captures of his tracking software, copies of the spreadsheets where he logged her every movement, recordings of conversations where he threatened her. He'd gotten careless over the years, confident that Eliza was too beaten down to fight back. But I wasn't beaten down. And I was ready to fight. I compiled everything into a single damning portfolio. Then I did 3 things. First, I sent it to divorce lawyers, top-tier attorneys who specialized in abusive relationships and had the resources to protect clients from powerful men. I included a note. This woman needs help. She doesn't know she can reach out to you yet, but she will. When she does, you'll already know everything. Second, I sent it to journalists, reporters who covered domestic abuse and wouldn't be intimidated by the Whitfield family name. I made sure they understood this was a pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident. Third, I sent it to Eliza, not directly. I knew if she saw it came from me, she'd dismiss it or assume it was revenge. So I made it look like it came from an anonymous women's advocacy group, an email that said, "We've been monitoring Marcus Whitfield's behavior through public records and mutual connections. We believe you may be in danger. Here is evidence of his pattern of abuse. You deserve better. Here are resources to help you leave safely." She called me 2 days later. I answered this time. "Did you send this?" she asked without preamble. "Send what?" "Don't play games, Cassandra. The email about Marcus, was it you?" "Why would I send you anything? We haven't spoken in 5 years." "Because you're the only person who's smart enough to dig this deep and angry enough to use it against me." "If I wanted to hurt you, Eliza, I'd have done it years ago. I don't care enough about you anymore to go to this much effort." There was a long silence, then, "Is it real, the evidence?" "I have no idea what evidence you're talking about. But if someone sent you proof that your husband is abusive, you should probably listen to them." "I don't know what to do." "That's not my problem." "Cassandra, I'm not your sister, Eliza, not anymore. You made sure of that along with Mom and Dad. So whatever decision you need to make it yourself. I'm not getting involved." I hung up. But of course, I was already involved. I'd been involved for years, pulling strings and positioning pieces. This had been the endgame all along. Eliza filed for divorce a week later. The media exploded. The journalists I'd contacted had been waiting for exactly this moment, and they had all the evidence I'd given them. Marcus's surveillance, his threats, his history of controlling behavior, it all became public. The Whitfield family tried to suppress the story, but it was too big. Too many outlets had it, too much documentation. Marcus was arrested for stalking and domestic abuse. His lawyers would eventually get the charges reduced. Money could buy a lot of justice. But his reputation was destroyed. His family's reputation was destroyed. The Whitfield Pharmaceutical Company's stock tanked as consumers and partners distanced themselves from the scandal. And my parents? They'd been the ones encouraging Eliza to stay with Marcus. They'd dismissed her concerns, called her dramatic, insisted she was lucky to have him. Now the whole city knew what Marcus was, and by extension, what my parents had been supporting. Their social circle evaporated overnight. The few friends they had left stopped returning calls. The community connections they'd relied on for years vanished. They'd chosen to sacrifice their daughters for social standing. Now, they had neither. The divorce took 2 years to finalize. Marcus fought it every step of the way, but Eliza had good lawyers, the ones I'd sent the evidence to, who took her case pro bono for the publicity. She got everything in the settlement. The house, the money, the freedom. Marcus was left with legal bills and a destroyed reputation. My parents tried to reconcile with her during this time. Tried to pretend they'd always been on her side, always known Marcus was bad news. She didn't let them rewrite history. In one of her court testimonies, she explicitly stated that our parents had pressured her to stay with an abusive man because they valued his family's wealth more than her safety. That testimony made the news. Mother's name was in the papers, forever associated with enabling abuse. Father tried to call me after that. I didn't answer. He sent an email. "Cassandra, I know you hate us. I know we failed you in ways I'm only starting to understand. But please, your mother is falling apart. Eliza won't speak to us. We've lost everything. I'm not asking for money. I'm just asking you to acknowledge that we're still your parents, that we still exist. Please." I thought about responding, thought about telling him that I'd orchestrated everything, that I'd pushed Eliza toward Marcus, hidden the evidence that would have saved her years of abuse, waited until the perfect moment to strike. But that would have been unnecessarily cruel. And I wasn't cruel. I was just done. So I wrote back, "You exist. I acknowledge that, but you exist the same way I existed for you growing up," as background noise. "As something inconvenient you can't quite get rid of. I'm treating you exactly the way you treated me. The difference is I've succeeded despite you, while you've failed despite all your advantages. That's not my fault. It's yours. He didn't write back. I'm 28 now, the same age I was when I died in my first life. But everything is different. In my original timeline, I'd spent years building a career while watching my family from a distance, still somehow hoping they'd be proud of me. I'd achieved everything I set out to do, but I died bidhadyan without ever feeling free of them. This time, I'm free. My company sold for $45 million, remember? I took that money and built something bigger, a venture capital firm that focuses on funding women-led startups. I use my knowledge of the future to pick winners, but I also create opportunities that didn't exist before. Companies that should have succeeded but didn't get funding in my first life now get their chance. I'm worth $380 million now. Forbes wrote a profile about me last year. The prophet of Silicon Valley, they called me. They don't know how accurate that title is. I have a penthouse with a view of the entire city. I travel whenever I want. I fund scholarships for kids from abusive homes. I live exactly the life I want to live. And my family? Father died 2 years ago. Heart attack, brought on by stress and a lifetime of poor health choices. I found out from his obituary in the paper. I didn't attend the funeral. Mother lives in a nursing home now. Early onset dementia, possibly stress-related. I pay for her care, but I've never visited. I just make sure she's comfortable. It's more than she ever did for me. Eliza rebuilt her life after the divorce. She went back to school, got a degree in social work, now counsels other domestic abuse survivors. We're not close. We'll never be close, but we're civil. She sends me a card every year on my birthday. I don't respond, but I don't throw them away either. She knows what I did. Not the details, but enough. She knows I pushed her toward Marcus, let her suffer, used her as a weapon against our parents. She's never confronted me about it directly, but I can see it in her eyes when we run into each other at charity events. She knows and she understands, because in a twisted way, I saved her. By letting her fall completely, by letting her hit bottom without a safety net, I forced her to save herself. She's stronger now than she ever would have been if I'd helped her in my first life. She has a life she built entirely on her own, with no one to credit but herself. It's not forgiveness between us. But it's something. Last week, I got a call from Mr. Chen. He's retiring and wanted to make sure all my legal affairs were in order. We met for coffee, and he told me something I hadn't known. Your grandmother would be proud of you, he said. She left you that inheritance because she knew your parents would never value you the way you deserved. She told me once that you reminded her of herself, too smart and too stubborn to let anyone define your worth. I wish I'd known her better, I said. She knew you better than you think. She left you something else, actually. Something to be given to you only after you turned 25 and only if I felt you were ready for it. He pulled out a letter, yellowed with age, my name on the envelope in grandmother's handwriting. I opened it with shaking hands. My dearest Cassandra, if you're reading this, then you've survived your parents. I'm sorry I couldn't do more to protect you while I was alive. They were my daughter and son-in-law, and I loved them, but I was never blind to their flaws. They chose Eliza because she was easy to love. You were chosen for something harder, to love yourself even when no one else would. The money I left you isn't meant to make you comfortable. It's meant to make you free. Free to choose your own path, free to build your own life, free to become whoever you were meant to be without their expectations weighing you down. Use it well. Use it to prove to yourself what I always knew, that you were worth more than they could ever see. With all my love, grandmother, I cried reading that letter. Not sad tears, cathartic ones, because grandmother had seen me, really seen me, and she'd given me the tools to save myself. Mr. Chen let me sit there for a while, crying in the coffee shop like a child. When I finally pulled myself together, he smiled. She was right about you, he said. You did become exactly who you were meant to be. I became who I needed to be to survive, I corrected. Sometimes that's the same thing. I'm in my penthouse now looking out at the city lights. It's late and I should probably sleep, but I'm thinking about the letter, about grandmother, about the life I've built on the ashes of the one I was supposed to have. Was it worth it? The revenge, the manipulation, the years of planning? I don't know. I destroyed my family as thoroughly as they tried to destroy me. I used my sister as a pawn in a game she didn't know we were playing. I watched my parents lose everything and felt nothing. But I'm free. Genuinely, completely free. I don't wake up hoping they'll love me. I don't measure my success against their approval. I don't carry their expectations like stones in my pockets. I chose myself. And that choice, that first terrible selfish choice to let Eliza suffer and my parents fail, led to every good thing in my life now. In my first life, I spent 28 years trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it. Then I died before I could enjoy the success I'd built. In this life, I stopped trying to earn what was never mine to have. I took what I needed, burned the bridges behind me, and built something new from the ashes. My phone buzzes. It's a text from a friend inviting me to dinner tomorrow. Real friends. People who chose me because they like me, not because they're obligated by blood or history. I text back, yes. And I smile. Because that's the real revenge, isn't it? Not that I destroyed them, but that I survived them. That I'm happy and successful and surrounded by people who value me. That I built a life so far beyond their imagination that they can't even comprehend what they lost when they chose to overlook me. They had a chance to choose me. Every day of my childhood, they had that chance. After Rebirth, I let them choose her again. And I made sure they could never choose me twice. Because I'd already chosen myself, and that choice made all the difference.